So today I'm going to be showing you how to start the painting portion of your acrylic grid drawn self-portrait. So at this point you should have every square gone through and blocked in with the outside edges to where it looks like we can see the divisions between our three basic values, our white, gray, and black color on our resource picture should be over here in our grid drawing. Now if you notice, of course, I do not have mine complete, but that's because I will do one teacher demo over the course of several semesters, so I will continue to add to this as I create different demonstrations for different classes. But for today, what I'm gonna work on is show you how to set up one corner of this. That way you can begin working on the painting portion for your project. So I have decided on my color scheme that I want to use. I'm gonna use an analogous color scheme with my light, medium, and dark value, representing the white for light, the gray for medium, and the black for dark. And I'm gonna use analogous green, blue-green, and blue. So today I'm gonna show you how to work with that. But of course you'll do this with whichever colors or color scheme you have chosen for your picture. The very first thing I recommend you do is go through your drawing and erase the grid lines that you've created, leaving just the outside grid lines, because we do still want those because we're going to be able to crop our picture down later. Now if you lighten up your drawing a little bit, that won't matter, but I do like to have those grid lines erased because acrylic paints tend to be a little transparent the first and sometimes second coat when you're applying it. So it's going to be really good if you don't have those on there because it'll be easier to cover up and give a really, really nice, smooth, flat color painting. I'm going to start with the lightest color first, and I'm going to paint all of the lightest colors in my whole painting first, and then progress to the medium color and then my darkest color. What you'll need are some acrylics. I'm just using some really inexpensive acrylics that I've got at home. And you should have a paint palette, a white styrofoam tray paint palette. I'm just going to be using a paper paint palette that I have at my house. You will need a cup with water, paper towels, and some paintbrushes. So to mix our very first color, this part is going to be really, really important, is we need to make sure that we mix that color light enough. So notice I've put out a good bit more white, about a quarter size dollop, and then very, very small, about dime size dollops of my other two colors. So to mix my light green, I'm going to start by wetting my paintbrush first in my cup of water. You never want to dip a dry brush straight into acrylics. So always start with a wet brush first, and I'm going to grab a pretty good sized dollop of my white for the starter. Now if we think about a value scale on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being white and 10 being black, we want our first color to be about a value 2, as light as we possibly can make it. So if I'm going to be mixing a green, I'm going to start with a pretty good dollop size white, and I'm just going to grab a tiny touch of yellow, and then an even smaller amount of blue. And I'm gonna slowly start mixing those together. And I'm just gonna grab itty bitty increments as I need. At this point, I want you to think, as far as the ratio of colors goes, about 98% white and about 2% other colors. And I'm trying to keep all of the paint into one sort of compact area, scooping it up and working it into that little area. And then once you think you've got a color that you like, this entire extra space over here on your painting is going to be an area for you to test your colors. I'm going for a light green that's so light it just looks barely darker than white, almost a mint color. And I do think that's actually a little bit too dark, so I'm going to add a little bit more white into it. And it's a little bit on the blue side, so I'm going to add a little bit more yellow. So this time it's a little bit lighter and a little bit more yellow. I think that's a nice happy light green. Now with this, typically what happens is students start to paint a light color and they think, oh, this will be light enough, and then they'll paint a whole section on their painting. But then as it dries, acrylic paint gets darker. So they end up having to go back and repaint it an even lighter color. So right now the color that you see needs to be extremely, extremely light. In your mind, think even lighter than what you actually want it to be, because it's going to darken as it dries. So this would be a much better example than this. This one will probably end up drying about to be this value, and this one will dry even darker, which is going to be too dark. So, because you have to remember, our light color in our resource picture is white. So we want this color super, super, super light to make sure that it looks okay from there. Now once you have your color, you're going to lift up a little bit of that color on your brush, and then very simply, this is going to be a massive paint by numbers. I like using a flat edge brush for large areas, edging it in right to the edge of the painting, right up to that grid line, and then using broad strokes to fan that color out and smooth the paint out in that section. Now when you get up to the edges, this part's going to be really important. You want to edge in your painting very, very carefully, and you can get a smaller, babier brush if you need to, but you want to paint right up to the edges and make sure, I try to keep like a little bit, like a little dollop of paint right there on the edge of my paintbrush. I don't want to cover up my pencil lines just yet. I want to just paint right up to those edges with a good thick coverage coating of paint. I don't want any white little specks of the paper to show through, but I want a really, really nice, smooth, flat coverage. Now you can, if you need to, if your paint's a little bit too thick, you can add a little smidge of water and thin it down a little bit, just if it's not flowing off of your brush easily. But be really careful, don't add so much water that you end up thinning it down where you're painting with it like watercolor. Acrylic paint is meant to be used thickly if you're trying to get a smooth, flat color the way that we are. Acrylic paints dry pretty quickly, so it's really important that you kind of experiment with how to go back over and smooth all that color out. We want it to be stroke free, and you can see that's a pretty good first coat. I'll end up eventually doing 2 to 3 coats on that to get it to where it's totally smooth and really, really uniform in a flat color. So while I have this color mixed up, I'll go ahead and begin painting those as well. And again, whenever you get into a smaller, more detailed section, you can either turn and use the tip edge of the brush, or you can switch and use a smaller detail brush. But I always like to use the biggest brush I can get away with because it paints faster, as long as I can cleanly paint right up to the edges without going over. If you'll notice, one of the things that I'm having to do pretty frequently with my hand is rotate my hand at different angles to make sure that from my line of sight, I can see where the edge of my bristles are painting along a shape. So I tend to turn my hand in a lot of different ways. That way I can really make sure that it's the front edge of the bristles painting an edge and not the back underside. I want to make sure I do that. That way I can very carefully paint inside of my lines. Now inevitably, you are going to get to a spot where you run out of color and you need to remix. So that can be a little stressful, but let me give you one piece of advice that will help you to do that. And that's going to be to, when you're trying to remix a color, you always want to remix it where it looks lighter than the dried version of your color. Because again, the color is going to dry darker than it will look while it's wet. Now that I've got that color mixed, I can try to test it out. So that looks darker than this one. So I'm going to add more white. And one reason you don't want to start off with too much paint all at once, because as you keep adding to it when you're trying to remix that color, I think I'm going to go a little yellower too, you will notice that you end up getting like larger and larger and larger quantities of paint. So don't start off with too much paint, because you're going to have to keep adding paint to it until you get that color right. So I think that's close enough for me to go through and continue filling in the end of that section. But if you get to a point where you're trying to remix a color and you think, oh gosh, I just absolutely cannot get it perfect, because let's be honest, practically nobody is going to be able to color match absolutely 100% exactly. So there's another good trick that I can show you as I come across and continue blending in with this new version, this remixed version of my color. So let's say that I've painted this section and I've smoothed it out, and it doesn't quite match exactly this first color from where I mixed that paint the first time, and I don't want there to be an awkward transition in color. There is a quick fix that you can do with that, and I'm just going to get just a little dollop of water on my paintbrush and swirl that around with some of the paints and mix up a slightly thinner version of that color. And while all of this is wet, I'm going to go right back into that first color, putting a nice light thin coat of that second color on it. And I'm going to go as close as I can to the edges, working pretty quickly. And that thinned down watery version So using that blending technique with that slightly thinned down, I can make that transition pretty smooth where that color is nice and flat. Once I would get that whole section, all that done, I would go back in and of course do a second coat of color. I'd give it a minute or two to dry, and probably by the time you get done with one section, the section you painted a minute ago is ready for you to go back in and apply a second, possibly even a third coat. Now I want to go ahead and show you how to start mixing your medium values. Once all of your light values through the whole painting are finished, you're then going to move on to your medium values. For me, that's going to be a medium blue-green. So if you have paint already mixed on your palette, I can mix straight into here if I'm not planning on using that color again. And this time when we think about our color mixing, instead of 98% white and about 2% color like in our first light value, we're going to now think about 96% white and 4% color. We still want this color to be extremely light. We don't want it to be a gigantic value jump, but significant enough to where we can see it. So now I'm just going to mix straight into this color. I've already got a lot of white in here, so I'm just going to add more blue and more yellow until I find a nice blue-green color. Now I also want to make sure not only is it going to be a little bit darker, but I want to make sure that I change the color distinctly enough into blue-green. Now that's a pretty big value jump, so I think I'm going to add maybe a smidge more white. And I think I still need for it to go even more in the blue side of blue-green. think that looks pretty nice. It's gonna dry a little darker than that, but I think that gives me, it's a pretty significant value jump, but it's still mostly white over here on the palette while it's wet. So I think that'll be okay. And if not, I can always update and adjust that color when I go in to make the second and third coats on it to make sure that it's solid and smooth enough with its coverage. Now, once I get to this section and I start painting my medium shade right next to my light shade, this time I am gonna go right up to and cover up that pencil line. I don't wanna see the first color with a pencil line and then the second color. I want the one color to butt right up next to that other color. And that's gonna give me those really pretty transitions. So now that sort of shows you, I of course need to finish filling in those parts, but I wanna jump ahead and go ahead and show you how to start in with your darkest color. Now, since I'm transitioning to just a pure dark blue, I'm gonna rinse my brushes out really well because I don't want any of that yellow from my greens to be mixed in with those. So for my dark blue, I still, with this particular painting assignment, I still want this color to have some white mixed into it. So I'm gonna start with that blue, and then I'm also just gonna add in just a little tiny touch of white to it. And the white is gonna help add some opacity to it. It is gonna lighten the color a little bit, but not enough, not nearly as drastic as what we have done with our light and our medium values. So just a little bit of white is gonna lighten that enough. And it also just helps make that color feel like it's in the same color family as our two other really, really tinted out shades. So with this color, and you can see, again, you can test it out. You can see how quickly, how dramatic that's gonna be. Okay, so that's just a little tiny bit of that section painted, but that gives you enough of an idea for how to go about starting your own painting. You will want to make sure that with each value step you have a nice contrast, especially the darkest value. I think that's one of the things that really makes these paintings pop when they are finished.